coming to Full Circle Bookstore this evening. We do appreciate the fact that we have such great support. We are the oldest and largest independent bookstore in Oklahoma City, and it means a great deal for us to be able to present author Andrew Gumbel.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming tonight. This is a very somber subject. Normally when you do book tours, you go to different cities, you talk about connections that the place has with whatever you've written about. This is a rather special place in this context, and I'm certainly not here to tell you your own story of what happened in this city 17 years ago, because I'm sure you know it much better than I ever will. And one of the things that's always moved me when I've come here is, first of all, how warmly I've been welcomed by everybody, but also how profoundly the bombing touched everybody here. It's a relatively small place. I've never met anybody from Oklahoma City who wasn't touched in a personal way in some way by the tragedy. The first time I came, I spoke to a number of the relatives of the victims, especially the children who died in the daycare center. And I thought, you know, I'm a British foreign correspondent. I've been to a lot of not terribly pleasant places around the world. This is just another assignment. And then, having spoken to them, I went down to the memorial and saw that fence with all the pictures of the dead children and the teddy bears and everything else. And it just got to me in a way that, you know, still is with me now. I went to the memorial this afternoon again, and it had the same effect. And, you know, years later in the course of researching this book, I talked to people who were hardened veterans of Vietnam and other conflicts, and they said themselves, this is Major Brown here, who was with the Sheriff's Department bomb squad. He was one of the people who said this, that, you know, he had never seen anything like this. And I think there's something unique about the spectacular violence that took place and the colossally unexpected, undeserved aspect of the fact that it happened here in Oklahoma City. So that's, you know, I want to say right from the outset that I come to this subject with a certain humility, especially in this city. And I'm certainly not here to tell you anything you don't already know. But I do think that there is an aspect to what happened and the way it's been told and retold over the years that has got lost. And that is really fundamentally the reason why this book got written in the first place. And it's what I want to talk to you about tonight. Because I feel that this city was let down fundamentally in a number of ways. Both before the bombing and then afterwards as well. The starkest contrast, I suppose, is with 9/11, when you had an extremely active and well-listened to victim community who managed to press for congressional hearings. Obviously, you know, there was a huge amount of political activity around the calamity that happened then. You had the 9/11 report. You had endless press being given to the subject. The Oklahoma City bombing was rather different. I think people to a large extent grieved in silence. I don't think that Congress necessarily was paying the kind of attention it should have done. There were one or two abortive attempts to start hearings. They didn't occur. And what you had essentially was the trial, and a trial is always a flawed exercise in finding out the truth. It's about the guilt or innocence of the defendant or defendants. It's not really about getting to the bottom of everything. I'm very fortunate as a researcher that some of the trial materials that didn't come out publicly at the time are now available. And the spur for writing the book was getting access to the full archive of all the materials that the government handed over to the defense teams in all three trials: McVeigh's federal trial, Terry Nichols' federal trial, and then his state trial here in Oklahoma a few years later. And so the possibility that arose was, instead of having guesses and questions and the sense that something was not quite right, there was a unique, really, opportunity to look precisely what was it that the government knew based on its investigation, what did it do with that information, what leads did it follow, what leads did it not follow, and what questions could one legitimately ask as a result of that. The other aspect of the project, which was, you know, a blessing for me as a researcher and a writer, was having got a hold of all this information. I thought this is an opportunity to go around, talk to everybody I possibly can, people who were in McVeigh's circle in that radical anti-government movement, the investigators who looked at the crime right from the very beginning, local, state, and federal, the street agents, their managers, their bosses in Washington, the prosecutors, the defense lawyers, and to my surprise and amazement, almost everybody was willing to talk. They were all willing to talk on the record, and a lot of them were very frustrated and in some cases pretty angry about the things that got left out, the roads that weren't taken, and the missed opportunities, starting before the bombing and going all the way through to McVeigh's execution several years later. So what do I mean when I say that Oklahoma City was let down? Starting before the bombing, there were a number of things that occurred that I think, in retrospect, seem very troubling. Some of them are very sort of basic and concrete. The way the building was actually constructed, the Murrah Building was built in the 70s. There was a decision made to skimp essentially on the way that the concrete pillars were reinforced. There were simple pieces of rebar. There was the number of things you can do to make buildings much stronger, like having coils of rebar. There are other things you can do. There was a FEMA study done after the bombing that showed that if the people who built the building had spent 1/8 of 1% extra on the budget, they could have raised the building to the level that would have met California earthquake standards. And probably when the bomb went off, you would not have had the pancake effect of having all those floors collapsing on each other. And about 3/4 of the people who died might have had their lives spared. So that's one fact that I think did come to light at the time. Another failure is that in the course of my research, I found out that the man in charge of protecting the building, Tom Hunt, who was the head of the Federal Protective Service, and at least one of the federal judges in the courthouse next door, Ronald Howland, were very concerned about a lack of security. And they were concerned for a number of reasons because it was their job to worry about this kind of thing. And they were specifically concerned after '93, after Waco, when the anti-government movement declared war, essentially, on the ATF, on the FBI. They made it very clear that they thought that anybody who worked for the federal government was a target. And in response to that, Hunt and Howland sat down. They talked about how they needed to have 24-hour security guard coverage, which didn't exist at the building. They needed to worry about the accessibility of the outside of the building to vehicles. They also were very concerned that the video cameras that were erected on the north side of the building were not functioning and hadn't been for years, and they wanted to rectify that. They went to the General Services Administration that ran the Murrah Building. They asked for the money to make these changes, and the answer was no. The GSA was trying to save money. Oklahoma City was not considered a place that was ever going to have anything happen, and that was that. Another letdown, I think. And then the bigger ones that I think affect the country as a whole, and really get to the core of what I'm writing about in the book, is that after Waco, after Ruby Ridge, there was an awareness among federal agents who followed these things for a living that there was a very serious threat of some kind of major attack. This was not a mystery to the people who've tracked the groups like the Order and the Covenant, the Sword and the Arm of the Lord in the 1980s, who committed assassinations, bombings. They robbed an armored truck, a lot of very alarming things. They were very concerned about the radical anti-government movement. They were very concerned in particular about a community in eastern Oklahoma called Elohim City, which we'll talk about more in a little bit, in part because some of the people who'd been active in the 1980s were gravitating back to that place. Information was starting to come out that other dangerous criminals who were later prosecuted for other crimes were either living there or passing through. And much as happened in the run-up to 9/11, the people who were shouting the loudest and issuing the warning saying you have to do something about this were ignored. Not only were they ignored, but the different federal agencies, in particular in this case the FBI and the ATF, that had little pieces of information were not pooling that information. They weren't sharing it when they got evidence of something alarming going on. Instead of going to each other, instead of going to the US attorney's offices and saying we really think that something needs to be done here, they took the opposite tack. Why did they do that? The FBI had been afraid for many years of being too proactive in terms of going after things that weren't necessarily directly related to crimes they knew about, but were more intelligence gathering operations to see if there was a possibility of future crimes. The FBI at the time was under Attorney General's guidelines not to do that. They'd got into trouble a number of times, especially in the 1980s, for going after groups against whom they didn't have concrete evidence of criminal activity. Congress had raked them over the coals. They'd also, in the wake of a lot of the activity from the radical far right in the 1980s, put together a sedition trial. Only the third time in the country's history that anybody was put on trial for sedition. They rounded up 14 members of the neo-Nazi white supremacist movement, put them on trial in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and things went very wrong. The judge decided he was going to dismiss